Welcome to Majoring in the Majors with Pastor S.J. Munson on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are available as podcasts. Find them at artistfirst.com. Your host is the author of two books, The Treasure of Israel and Christ Held Hostage, the Hijacking of American Christianity. Here he is, Pastor S.J. Munson.
Hi, this is S.J. Munson, and welcome to Majoring in the Majors. Recently, the words anti-racist and anti-racism have entered into our national discussion, and we have on our show tonight a special guest who's going to help us talk about that and unpack what that means. Her name is Kate Slater, and she is the author of The Anti-Racist Roadmap, a great book. She's currently the Assistant Dean of Graduate Student Affairs at Brandeis University. Previously, she was the Associate Director and Manager of Programs at the Institute for Recruitment of Teachers, which is a nonprofit that promotes racial equity in the American educational sector. She's also a lecturer at the University of New Hampshire for the course Teaching Race, which explores the history of race and racism in America. She also investigates white racial identity formation and how racism operates individually, organizationally, and systematically. She leads facilitations and trainings, both for the public sector and educational institutions and the private sector as well. And she's here tonight. Thank you so much, Kate, for being here and making time for us.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, you admit that you're a white woman. You're talking about race. How did you come to do this anti-racist work? What was your journey like?
Well, yes, certainly the most salient aspect of my identity in doing this work is that I'm a white woman, which means I am in the position of being the person who enacts harm and does the oppressing. And so I came to this work about 6 years ago through my work at the Institute for Recruitment of Teachers. And I want to start, S.J., by saying that I was raised in Maine, and Maine is a very, very, very white state. And I spent much of my adult life really being in predominantly white spaces without ever, knowing that I should seek out anything differently, or knowing what it meant that it was so easy for me to insulate myself in friend groups and workplaces and spaces, educational spaces that were predominantly white. And it was when I came to my work at the Institute for Recruitment of Teachers that I really began to develop a critical lens into how systemic racism operates in our society and how it makes itself manifest in all of these different institutions that exist in America. The Institute for Recruitment of Teachers, I was supporting predominantly students of color, almost entirely students of color, and I was supporting them in the process of applying to graduate programs in the arts, humanities, and social sciences, which also happened to be very, very, very white. And so that work really brought me face to face with not only needing to understand the systems that I was up against and that my students were up against, but also, moreover, to understand my own complicity as a white person in those systems. And so really my work in anti-racism is, if you could put it more specifically, it's talking to white people about what it means to be white in the service of social justice, about what whiteness represents, and about the ways in which we as white people benefit from all of these different systems and privileges that are afforded to us simply because of our skin color, and then how we can begin to divest from that and divest from what that means in the service, of social justice and racial justice. So just a pithy aside, a quick little primer on how I got into this work.
That's great. Now, when you talk about anti-racism, you freely admit that you are a racist, which is a provocative thing to say because I'm talking to you and you don't seem like a card-carrying racist, but you admit that your upbringing, your worldview has been shaped by racism and a racialized society. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So, race is a social construct, not a biological one, which means
Right.
race, if you go back through the history of understanding the history of race is something that was assigned and created to justify exploitation and oppression and capitalism. And that's a whole history that far more brilliant scholars than me have dived into. But what that essentially means is that we live in a world where race is not a biological factor, but it is a very real determinant in lived experiences and life outcomes for people of different races. And when I say I am a racist, I am saying I have grown up in a world where race is a determining factor in people's life outcomes. Therefore, I have absorbed messaging about race and racism my entire life. So educator Beverly Daniel Tatum describes racism as the smog we breathe, which I think is a really profound metaphor. We have been absorbing messaging about differences in race and preferences in race from our teachers, from our caregivers, from our family members, from our friends, from our earliest days. And so therefore, we live in a world where we have preconceptions about people based on their race. And that's why, I think a lot of people really shy away from the term racism, and I'll say a lot of white people, because they've absorbed the idea that racism kind of falls within the good-bad binary. And what I mean there is you think if I am a good person, I can't be racist. Being racist is bad, but I'm a good person, therefore I cannot be racist. And the challenge there, SJ, is that forestalls a lot of the conversations and a lot of the work before it even starts. And so once you accept that good people can be racist and are racist in that they have preconceptions and prejudices about people based on their race and they act accordingly, that right there means that you recognize the essentialness of doing anti-racist work, because nobody is excused from the necessity of that work, right? And so I think we often have to remove the kind of the moral weight of whether we call someone racist or not racist. Once we accept we all just are, then we can move beyond that, right? That's when we can start digging in and start doing the work.
Okay. Now, in your work, you talk a lot about white supremacy, and it's a term that we hear a lot. But what does that mean exactly? What is white supremacy, and how does it function, particularly in our society?
So, I think that a lot of us, when we hear the word racist and we think of that term, we immediately hop to these very extreme ideas of what white supremacy looks like. So, I know I'm probably repeating examples that you've heard before, but, members of the KKK wearing hoods, people who stormed the Capitol waving Confederate flags and dangling nooses. These are these kind of very extreme visions of what racism and white supremacy look like. And what I talk about a lot is when we break down the term white supremacy, that's simply the idea that whiteness is the ideal and the default and the norm. So that just means that whiteness describes that we just kind of, as white people, we jump to a whitewashed world because it's never occurred to us to seek out anything different. And you see this, in representation in movies and in authors who are on the bestseller list. And when you open any magazine at the grocery store, you understand how whiteness, again, is often the ideal and the default and the norm. And that is because you have white people who are in positions of power and leadership that perpetuate this worldview. So the reason that I talk about white supremacy in these kind of everyday concepts is because I want white people to think about how they contribute to and enact white supremacy in their day-to-day interactions. How do they do it in staff meetings? How do they do it in the PTA? How do they do it when they're talking to their kids' teachers about curriculum? How do they just kind of jump to whiteness as the default and the norm in their everyday interactions, and therefore act in racist ways. And I think, again, the more that white people can really practice, and I don't mean to extend to practice, there's an urgency and a necessity to doing this work. This is racial justice. The more that we can wrap our heads around the fact that we act in racist and white supremacist ways a dozen times a day without even being aware of it, that's when we can begin to really begin to deconstruct what that means and unpack what that means in the service of liberation, in the service of social and racial justice.
Let's get that posted right
now. What does that look like practically on a daily basis? Let's say that I'm a teacher in a high school, I'm planning curriculum, or I'm a teacher in a community college. What sort of things I'm a white person, what sort of things am I doing on a daily basis I'm just not conscious of? What does that look like? I'm sure you've heard lots of stories and things that people have come up with that when they realize, aha, I'm doing these things.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, it can take any number of forms. Certainly in curriculum, you see this represented in, when we talk about Black History Month, we narrow the accomplishments of Black people in this country and African American and people in this country to these kinds of pithy sound bites. Or we tend to evangelize particular Black scholars and activists and creatives without critiquing the systems and structures that they were combating. So a perfect example of this is the way that people talk about Rosa Parks as this kind of benign, tired old lady who just kind of, happened to sit on a bus and spark this movement when, actually Rosa Parks was young and was an avowed activist and had, really, really amazing radical beliefs and was making changes long before the Montgomery bus boycott. Or people, similarly who kind of, for example, view the Black Panthers as a terrorist organization and kind of describe it in these very one-dimensional ways without recognizing, first of all of the systemic violence and oppression that the Black Panthers were fighting against, and their community-oriented programming. I mean, they were giving free lunch to school children in Harlem. They were, doing after-school programming. So I think that you see this a lot in these kind of one-dimensional views of curriculum. But the other ways that you see it are in the ways that white people often respond to the behavior of students of color or people of color or colleagues of color with this kind of racially coded language or these racially coded frameworks. The idea that in a staff meeting, if, for example, a Black woman speaks up, that she could be described as angry or aggressive, whereas a white person who said the exact same comment would probably not receive the same critique. And what does that say about the messaging or the coded language that we use about Black anger or Black frustration? It comes up in these seemingly benign ways. For example, if you describe a neighborhood as sketchy, and that's a neighborhood that has predominantly people of color, well, what are you saying about that neighborhood? What are you actually saying about it? What are the comments that you're drawing about crime and your discomfort around people of color and these kind of broad, sweeping claims that you might make about spaces that aren't predominantly white? So it's really, once you start to think about the ways that racism shows up in your day-to-day interactions and the ways in which you unknowingly participate in it, you begin to see the kind of deeply layered, complex structures that undergird systemic racism in this country. And the hardest part, I think, is that now that there is colorblind racism, it's harder to identify. Someone who calls out, for example, in a staff meeting, a Black woman for coming across as aggressive, that's a little harder to identify as being racist than if you said, I don't think she's qualified for this job, or I don't think she belongs here, or if you put on your KKK hood, And because that racism becomes harder to identify, it becomes harder to confront and break down, right? And that's one of the really, that's one of the challenges of the moment we're in, is that colorblind racism means that a lot of people think racism isn't a problem any longer. And it is. All you have to do is look at the statistics around disparities in this country according to race and know that systemic racism is alive and well and thriving. But the kind of lure of colorblind racism is that a lot of people think we're in a post-racial age. We had a black president. Surely we've solved racism.
Right. What about from the student perspective? You've worked a lot with students who are students of color who go into institutions which are largely white or overwhelmingly white. What kind of things do they confront on a daily basis?
Oh, my goodness. So there's a particular phenomenon called racial battle fatigue, which many students of color experience in predominantly white spaces, which you could sum up as death by 1,000 paper cuts. And racial battle fatigue is what happens when students of color or people of color in predominantly white spaces on a daily basis are subjected to these kind of microaggressions, these mini comments, the kind of either hypervisibility of their existence or their invisibility, and fundamentally the feeling that they don't belong. And then they experience that day after day after day after day after day. And the cumulative psychological and physical impact of racial battle fatigue are significant. They're significant on mental health, they're significant on physical health. And this is often what the students that I was working with would describe, is they're in a predominantly white space. They feel like, many of them say they feel like eyes are always on them. They feel as if they don't belong. They feel as if their skill and their knowledge and their validity in that space is constantly questioned. And that's by their educators and their fellow students alike. And so, I'd invite all of the listeners to think about the last time, if you're white, the last time you were in a space where you felt like you didn't belong because you were white. The last time that you felt that for a sustained period of time. And the truth of it, SJ, is that many of us white people have never had that experience of being in a space for a prolonged period of time and feeling othered because we were white. And yet this is an experience that many people of color have almost every single day of their life. And so for white people, I think we can't actually conceptualize what a significant toll that would take.
My wife and I adopted a little girl years ago, and she was biracial, African American and white European and Native American. And I always thought, I was aware of racism around me, but then when you have a daughter, and you're a father, all of a sudden you were hypervigilant, and I was just so surprised at how subtle the racism is, subtle racism that I wasn't aware of before, because I just wasn't attuned to it. Now that I have a daughter, I see it everywhere, and it's a raised eyebrow, roll of the eyes, little tiny comments, not racial epithets, not things that we would normally associate with overt racism, but sort of like, keep your daughter away from my car. I just had it waxed. I don't want her sticky fingers on my car. I know exactly what you're saying. And little things with my daughter. We were at a grocery store, and a bunch of kids came in at the same time, and they were white kids, all about the same age as my daughter. And they came rushing by this one older woman and kind of shoved her out of the way a little bit. They just weren't aware, what they were doing. They were kids. And the woman just smiled and laughed, and then my daughter came by, and the woman did the same thing that they did. She was just copying them. And the woman reacted like she was being shoved over. Don't you teach your daughter any manners? those kind of little things that
Right.
I imagine, over years and years can build up and do a lot of psychological harm.
Mhm. Mhm. And just like you said, the fact that they're not overt acts of racism means they're so much harder to pinpoint or confront. I'm sure if you had said to this woman in that moment, "Hey, that's racist," she would have said, "No, it's not. How could you say that? I'm not racist. I'm a good person. I don't have a racist bone in my body." And that forestalls any conversation, right? And this is the most insidious part of these covert acts of racism is your daughter is experiencing these things daily, and yet the ability to confront it is so much more limited because it is so covert and subliminal.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've written a book called The Anti-Racist Roadmap, and anti-racist and anti-racism are words that we've been hearing a lot more in the past few words, a lot of books out there talking about this. Who coined this term, and what does it really mean to be anti-racist?
Right. Well, first of all, let me just correct you, SJ. As much as I would have loved to write a book, so the anti-racist roadmap is it's just a toolkit. I won't say it's just a toolkit. It's an awesome toolkit, but it is really a workbook, if you will, that I created with my colleague Mira Stern to help folks actually figure out what it means to do the work when it comes to being anti-racist. But I'm happy to talk a little more about anti-racism. So hard to know who coined the term. Ibram Kendi, who wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist, is widely credited with kind of talking about it, but the truth is that many scholars of color, Angela Davis notably, was talking about it decades ago. And what the term anti-racist essentially says is that in a colorblind society, in the society that we're in right now, which is, again, quote-unquote post-racial, saying I don't have a racist bone in my body, so being neutral when you see instances of racism is actually not enough. So being not racist is not enough. And that's a really interesting about face, I think, for a lot of white people to wrap their heads around, because so many of us have been taught that being not racist is actually the ideal, right? Being not racist means we're good people. We're not racist. But it's kind of like that, the Desmond Tutu quote, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. That's really how I describe anti-racism. Anti-racism asks for deliberate action to fight anti-racism. It says if you as a white person are witnessing covert or overt acts of racism, you don't just get to tap out. You don't get to say, well, I didn't do the harm, therefore I'm absolved of responsibility. It's actually our responsibility to combat the racism when we see it. That means showing up and confronting it. That means maybe at the grocery store, some white person would have spoken up and said to that woman, why did you call her out? Why did you call your daughter out as opposed to these other kids? That's not okay. Have you thought about why you called that out? It requires an active stance. It requires white people to interrupt and confront racism, not only in other people, but also when we notice ourselves having racist thoughts or acting in racist ways. So it's a much more active stance than simply saying, well, I didn't directly do the racist harm, therefore I'm good. It's all copacetic, right?
Right. Now you talk about, how this journey of disentangling ourselves as white people from a racist system, this journey of becoming anti-racist. It's not really about us, because so often I think people can make it about themselves. It's like at some point we're going to reach this point where this button pops up and like a turkey, and I've achieved anti-racism. No, it's not about us. Can you explain that a little more?
Yes, absolutely. I'm so glad you said that. And I agree. I think a lot of white people, when we kind of heard the term anti-racist, we want to become that, right? Just like you said, we want to go away like little anti-racist caterpillars and emerge in a couple months, fully formed anti-racist. But being anti-racist, as Ibram Kendi stresses, it's not an end game, and it certainly is not an exercise in white people's self-improvement to be a better person. And something that was pointed out to me this past summer was the necessity of talking about the end game of anti-racism as being liberation. And so when I talk about the end game of the work I'm trying to do, my end game is liberation from oppression for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and really all historically marginalized identities. Because anything less than that is insufficient. So liberation from oppression means being able to live without fear of being shot in your house at night by police. It means being able to go to the grocery store and buy Skittles without being killed. It means living your life without the fear that you will be hurt, harmed, or killed because of your skin color. And fundamentally, as a white person, I have never lived in that existence. I have never been afraid for my existence because of my skin color. And so liberation happens when that can be extended to all communities and people of color. And the reason that is important to me to talk about things in that context is because there is so much language about anti-racist work, and there's language around diversity and equity and inclusion and multiculturalism and belonging, and all of those for me dance around the ultimate goal. Equity and inclusion for me is talking about people having a seat at the table and having their voices be heard. Belonging means that they feel as if they have a space at that table. Diversity, bringing more voices. Multiculturalism is representation of all these different cultures. But at the end of the day, all of those fall short of the ultimate goal, which is this liberation from oppression. And so I think it's really important to recognize that if we are as white people are acting in ways that are anti-racist, are pledging our lives to anti-racist action, that work only ends when liberation from oppression happens. And until that day comes, we don't get to take our foot off the gas. We don't get to decide, good enough, we're good enough, like we've reached the level of going clear that we're really shooting for. You really recognize that living your life in an anti-racist way is forever. That's a lifetime commitment. It's not an end game that you arrive at. It's a way of being, and it's a way of moving through the world. And that's what I think I want people to know about anti-racism is it's describing the journey. It's not a destination. So
how do we become anti-racist? I mean, what are some practical steps? I like that you call your workbook a roadmap. And thank you for the correction, by the way. It is a workbook because you're doing work, and the work is ongoing. But you give some really basic principles here. Can you talk about how does one begin? What are the steps that you begin to take to become anti-racist?
So I think that if you live your life in an anti-racist way, the steps that you have to take are equal parts self-education and then doing the work. And so I'll talk about those both a little more in depth. So the self-education piece is absolutely critical. And I think for many white people, especially this summer, launched this kind of frenzy of learning and unlearning, is the way I put it. Basically, unlearning a story of America, perhaps, that we as white people now realize is whitewashed and one-dimensional and didn't include the critical number of voices of people of color. And so a lot of people this summer said, I didn't know things were still this bad. I didn't understand. And so the question is, what has allowed you as white people to not have to see that, to not have to learn that? So that learning and unlearning is really critical. And this is the self-education piece that is ongoing. This is where you have to read the books. You have to listen to the podcasts. You have to seek out stories and narratives and podcasts and webinars and speeches that challenge your white supremacist ways of thinking, that challenge the racist assumptions that, frankly, have been allowed to go on unchecked for most white people much of their lives, if not all of their lives. You know, I talk about being at the IRT and all of a sudden being privy to not only a lot of critical educational theory, but just a lot of narratives of students of color that were describing their experiences that were so at odds with the world that I had seen up until that point. And hearing those stories is what prompted me to say, I need to investigate, first of all, what your lived experience is, so I can begin to figure out the structures that have created these conditions. And I also need to unlearn my own worldview, where I've made particular assumptions about my life, my belonging, my skill sets that are actually pretty one-dimensional. So that unlearning is ongoing. It's always challenging and complicating and nuancing your assumptions. And then there's the piece that goes with that, which is you actually have to do the work. So this is where, you know, I go back to that conversation, what we just said about being a turkey and your done button pops up. You don't just get to go away as a white person in your cocoon and spend the next 5 years reading a whole lot of books. That's, you don't get to come out fully formed. And so doing the work means that you are putting yourself on the line. You are willing to confront racism imperfectly. You are willing to reappropriate resources and money and skills to communities that have historically been disenfranchised. And so this is where the impetus for the anti-racist roadmap came into play. So my colleague Mira Stern and I, and Mira is amazing, y'all should check her out. She's an educator in the Bay Area. She and I had both been facilitating conversations about anti-racism. And what we heard over and over is, I don't know what it means to do the work. And so we said, okay, let's put together a toolkit that essentially pairs the learning and unlearning with actual tangible steps that white people can take to do the work. And so the roadmap really identifies, how do you confront racism? How do you show up in your white circles and hold people accountable? How do you hold yourself accountable? What can you give up in the service of racial liberation? So the roadmap outlines a bunch of areas in your life where you can actually begin to think creatively about what you can give up. So, you know, this summer I heard a lot, SJ, of people saying, well, I already make monthly donations and, you know, we're in a pandemic, so I don't want to go to protests. As if those are the only ways that white people can show up for racial justice, right? And there's so many other ways that you can show up. And so the roadmap has you go through these different areas. One area is money and resources, that we call them impact areas. So money and resources, close community, workplace, talents and skills, and advocacy and organizing. And it prompts you to think in creative ways about what talents and resources you have in each of those particular areas that you can reallocate for social justice, for racial justice. So, you know, for example, money and resources. Monthly donations are great. Have you ever thought about what it would look like if you bought every single birthday gift from a business that was owned by a person of color? Have you thought about what would it mean to open an account at a Black-owned bank? Have you thought about what would it mean to donate a car or, you know, maybe rent your house for a few months to someone who's a person of color at a reduced rate? Have you thought about what it would look like to give up your stimulus check? It's asking you to think more creatively and expansively about what you have to contribute. And so, for, you know, to build off of that, a lot of folks were like, well, I don't have a lot of money, but I have talents and skills that I can commit. So, you know, do you have, can you review resumes? Can you do business coaching on a pro bono level? Do you have some kind of media platform that you can give up to people? Can you even babysit for people in your community while they go to a protest or a meeting? Those are all things that you can give up in terms, you know, in service of racial justice that go beyond the kind of idea of I either need to make monthly donations or I need to be out protesting. And so that was really the aim of the anti-racist roadmap, is to have people think expansively about what it means to be a white person who is giving up privileges and real actual resources that you have at your disposal in service of racial justice. So I hope you all check it out. It's free, it's downloadable, and it's printer friendly.
Now, where can we go to download that? And if you want to talk about your website.
Absolutely. So you can go to my website, which is kateaslater.com, and there's no www, it's just kateaslater.com. And there you can see I'm a contributor to NBC Today, so you can see some of the articles that I've written about, intersectional justice and racial justice. I have a ton of resources on there, so if you're thinking about learning and unlearning, I've put my favorite articles up on there that I think are really valuable. And then you can download the Anti-Racist Roadmap there. And again, the Anti-Racist Roadmap has been used, at this point in time, we just launched it in January, and libraries are using it, and colleges and universities are using it, and a ton of businesses are using it. So please feel free to grab it and share it with your circles and let me know what you think.
That's great. Yeah, I have checked out your website. It's full of stuff that is just so helpful. You have podcasts and webinars, as well as other people talking about these issues as well. Just a lot of good stuff, helpful stuff. So thank you so much for that. Now, one of the things that you shared once in your webinar was you talked about the sort of the silence from the Black community that white people can receive once they sort of joined the cause. I confess that when I decided, I'm starting this radio show, and I'm going to use this radio show to help champion the cause of anti-racism. And I sent out, a lot of emails every month to various members of the Black community, activists, academics, authors, and so forth, and received resounding silence. And I thought, what do these crickets mean? And don't they like me? And I realized, okay, it's not about me. It's not about me. It's about, like you said, welcome to the party. You're late, but better late than never. There's the dip over there. Pour yourself a drink. Can you talk about that response?
Well, yes, and yeah, you again, I'm borrowing a quote from a former classmate of color of mine, and he put it so beautifully. He said, white people want credit for coming to the party, and the truth is they should have been at the party a long time ago, and it's great they're here now. Yeah, but they should have been here, just like you said, a couple centuries ago. And so I think when a lot of white folks wrap their heads around the necessity of their being anti-racist and the necessity of them interrupting racism, what they then want is a pat on the back for really being a good white person now, right? And the truth is, like I said, anti-racist action is not about our own self-improvement. And we really, really, really have to move beyond that impulse, because the truth is, there have been scholars and writers and creatives who have been telling white people how they have to show up for literal centuries. And just because we just came to an understanding now doesn't mean we get cookies. You know what I mean? We don't get to
no cookie.
Aren't I? Yeah, exactly. No cookies for. And I mean that not to sound pithy, but we should have been doing this work our entire lives. And that doesn't negate from the fact that it's great we're here now. And I think that the thing that can be often challenging about being a white person who commits to anti-racist activism is that often you have to sit into competing truths. And you have to be really okay with with moving outside of binary thinking. So again, to start with the first example, you can be a good person and be racist. And both those things can be true at once. And you can be commended for coming to anti-racist work now, and you should have been doing it all this time. Both those things are equally true and equally valid. And I think that, again, this is where the framework of liberation is very helpful because it reminds us white people all the time to decenter our own self-congratulatory impulses. We are not here to get it's not about us. It's not about us. If you're committed to anti-racist activism, if you're committed to that cause, it's for the liberation of people of color. And so our well-being and our good intentions they're not centered in that action, right? They're in service of the cause. They're not the center of the cause. And so, I think that white people really have to move past the impulse to want congratulations and want praise and want to get it right, which is hard because we're in a space that feels very unfamiliar, and we're in a space that feels really tenuous. Confronting racism, especially in yourself when you've never had practice doing that before, can feel very, very, very scary. And yet, we still have to move beyond that, and we have to accept that we're going to show up, and it's going to feel incredibly uncomfortable. And yet, we still continue to commit to that work, because at the end of the day, we as white people, we represent racism. We don't experience racism. And so sitting with that discomfort, quite frankly, that's a small price we have to pay in the service of racial justice.
Mm. Now you talk about the concept of intersectionality and racial justice. What do you mean by that, and why is an intersectional approach important when we're dealing with anti-racism?
Right. So intersectionality is a term that was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. And what it talks about is the kind of intersecting identities that can compound oppression. And so, for example, if you think about not just race, but also the intersections of gender and class and different abilities and socioeconomic status and language skills, all of these different identity components can intersect to either to augment the experiences of oppression. So, for example, a Black trans woman in this country is significantly more likely to experience a violence and death than a Black cis woman. And a differently abled Latinx individual who perhaps is in a wheelchair is going to experience different levels of oppression than a traditionally abled Latinx woman. And so the reason I say that is because in the service of liberation, I know we can't pick which oppressed identities we're going to throw our weight behind. And often what I hear is when I have conversations about racism, people kind of want to focus just on one element of racism instead of thinking about all of these other competing identities. So they often think of racism in the black-white binary. They don't think, for example, of Asian American violence, violence against Asian American communities that we've recently seen. But the reason that we have to have an intersectional approach is because freedom from oppression for people, for Black and Brown and Indigenous people, is as salient as freedom from oppression for trans individuals, or people, again, who are differently abled, or people of different class structures. And it's this kind of lift as we climb approach. And so some of the most important social justice movements in history have been the ones where people from different identities recognize the shared commonality of their mission as opposed to needing to sit in their difference. So the reason we have to take that approach is because, again, it's a lift as we climb mentality. When we begin to take an intersectional approach to social justice and we break down these layers of oppression, we recognize that uplift has to be for all communities, not some communities at the further expense of others.
Right. Now, you work with the private and the public sector. You do seminars using your roadmap. How generally, how has this been received, and are you encouraged?
It's generally been received pretty well. I think, so let me say this in another way. I have definitely received critique, plenty of critique. And quite frankly, there are plenty of people, both white people and people of color, who think, white people shouldn't be doing these conversations. And I accept that, and I take that in, and I listen to that feedback. And I think what has helped me is getting very, very, very hyper-focused on what my lane is in social justice work. So the way I describe the work that I'm doing is I basically talk to other white people about my own process of working through my internalized racism and what it means to deconstruct whiteness in the service of liberation. So in that, I am talking about the movement towards racial justice through my own lived experience as a white person. What I am not doing is speaking about racism as someone who has never experienced it. So I'm not here to translate experiences of racism. I'm not here to couch it so that white people can receive it, a little bit more easily. What I'm here to do is talk about my own process and the things that I've learned, because I've been doing this work for 6 years, and I still have so much work to do, and I still have so much to learn. And I think, like you said, a lot of white people get stymied in what it means to do the work. And I can provide a little bit of guidance to that. But of course, the goal is that at the end of the day, the way I describe my work is I'm the bumpers in a bowling alley. At the end of the day, white people still need to get to the strike zone, which means that they need to be willing to show up and hear about experiences of racism from people who have experienced it and adjust their lives and their actions accordingly. I can help them get to the strike zone by telling them what I have learned, but I'm not in the strike zone. And that's a really pithy metaphor, but I want to make very clear that in the work I'm doing, I am not attempting to put a white lens on experiences of racism. I'm trying to talk about what I've learned, what my research has revealed, and what I've seen in hopes that that can help other white people get there. But, again, there's plenty of critique there, and I think all critique is an opportunity to learn and to be reflective and to, adjust our actions accordingly.
Now, you talk about, you coined the term sustainable anti-racism. Can you tell us what that means? How do you define that?
Yes, and again, I love this credit. I'm not sure I coined it, but I definitely use it. And I think what I talk about when I talk about sustainable anti-racism is, again, when we're sitting in two competing truths, white people should have been at the party for decades, right? And at the same time, the process of white people unlearning and learning about racism is a very intense process. And so what I've seen this past summer is what other folks have written about is this kind of allyship burnout, where white people all of a sudden, after the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, understood all of a sudden the way that racism showed up in American society, and then spent the next 3 months trying to learn the entire history of race and racism in America in 3 months. And basically completely overloaded themselves to a point where what they said is, I'm burned out and I'm going to pull back from this work. And that is real. And that is a perfect example of white privilege. For a white person to be able to say, I'm tired of learning about racism.
I'm going on vacation. I'm going to Cancun.
Exactly. I'm going to tap out for a couple months. Again, how privileged that we get to learn about racism as opposed to experiencing it, right? And yet, there is also the truth that this is a painful process that takes time. And so when I talk about sustainable racism, I talk about sitting in these two competing truths. We are immensely privileged as white people to be able to dip our toe in, and we shouldn't be dipping in. We should be diving full on into the river. But also at some point in time, we have to tread water for a little bit. And so I'm trying to both sit in the competing priorities of the urgency of this work and also recognize that this work takes time. And that's, so when I talk about sustainable anti-racism, I talk about how do you as a white person approach anti-racist action in a way where you fold it into your being. Again, like I said, it's a way of living your life. It's a way of moving through this world. You can't do that by staying up until 4 a.m. every single night for the next year reading about the history of chattel slavery in this country. So how do you fold it into your life where it becomes a part of your life sustainably? As you would for anything that you believed in or cared about, as you would for, taking care of your mind, for spending time with loved ones, for exercising, for eating right. And I don't mean to make it sound as pithy. I'm saying for me, my anti-racist education, my learning and unlearning is as critical to my livelihood as breathing or sleeping or eating. And so I make time for it. And I build it into my life every single day. And that's what I mean when I talk about sustainable anti-racism.
Mm-hmm. And I guess we have to look, as you said, it's a lifetime journey. It will never end for us. Mm-hmm. And we have to look at the bigger picture and the longer journey where we're headed and make sure that we, as you said, don't burn out and give up because it can be intense. It can be discouraging. You said there's an element of shame and discomfort that we have to be comfortable with. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of when again we go back to the idea that racism is the smog we breathe. We don't, as white people, ever have to be aware of our racist actions, of the ways in which we have harmed people and done racist things in our lives. That's the kind of evil genius of the smog we breathe. And so when you as a white person begin to break down your own internalized racism and the things that you've done, that can often result in this absolute meltdown where you're replaying everything you ever said to a person of color in your life, and you're just thinking, oh my God, what have I done?
Yeah.
And with that, and that's real. That's totally real. You're seeing every single interaction in these very different frameworks. And with that, I think, comes this absolutely paralyzing fear that you will mess up again. And so that is one of the things that I think often when we talk about sustainable anti-racism keeps white folks from doing this work long term. So, let's talk this through a little bit. You're a white person. You've spent the last 8 months learning and educating yourself. You've done a lot of reading. You've done a lot of work. You've even talked to some people in your circle. Next week, you go into a staff meeting, and you inadvertently say something racist to your colleague who is a woman of color. You didn't mean to, but you said it. When that person confronts you about it, or hopefully what happens is a white colleague confronts you about it, this unleashes an avalanche of shame. You should have known better, right? You should have known. You should have done the right action. How could you screw up after spending all this time doing the work to make sure that you didn't cause harm? And then white people use that as an excuse to say, nope, I'm not cut out for this work. I'm tapping out. And that is often, I think, a really critical tension that white people have to sit in. I mess up frequently. I say things that are racist. I say things that are racially coded. I do things that cause harm, and I'm going to continue to. And that is because I am a white person living in a racist society. And the real rubber meets the road when, as a white person, you don't use that as a sign that you should just curl up in a ball and die of shame. You use it as an opportunity to atone, to make racial repair, to apologize, and then to educate yourself and others so it never happens again, right? And it's brutal, because what I would love to say is there is a level of learning that happens where white people are never going to cause harm again. But again, we are living in a racist society, and so we will inevitably cause harm. And so the real thrust of the work comes comes in knowing that you have the tools and the ability and the humility to receive feedback when it comes in and act accordingly and atone for what you've done and learn from that experience.
Well, wow, that's good stuff. Kate Slater, thank you so much for being here tonight. And Kate Slater, author of The Anti-Racist Roadmap, and check out her website, kateaslater.com. And great to have you. And God bless you in your work. It's so important.
Thank you so much. Do the work, everyone.
Do the work. Amen. Thank you all for tuning in. If you have any questions or comments for us here at Majoring in the Majors, you can write to majoringinthemajors at gmail.com. Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.